My husband accused me of leaking data to save his brilliant career. I was humiliated, suspended, almost jailed, but I came back, not as a wife, but as a lawyer with evidence. And now he's not a hero, he's a criminal. My name is Emily Wilkins. I'm 38 years old, and I've spent the past 15 years building a career I can be proud of. As an attorney, I've always been fiercely dedicated, sharp, and passionate about seeking justice. My reputation speaks for itself, clients trust me, colleagues respect me, and the law is my guiding principle. I've spent countless hours working late into the night, poring over case files, and sharpening my skills to become one of the best in my field. But, beyond the courtroom, there's another side to my life, my marriage. I've been married to David Wilkins for over a decade. David is a prosecutor, a man of honor and integrity, or so I thought. He's the kind of man who works tirelessly to put criminals behind bars. And to the world, he's a hero. I've always admired him for his dedication, even if it meant long hours apart. Together, we've built a life that others envy, an upscale home, the latest gadgets, dinners at high-end restaurants, and vacations that seem like they belong to the pages of a magazine. People see us as the perfect couple, the ones who have everything figured out. The truth is, we've worked hard for this. The late nights, the sacrifices, the compromises, it's all been worth it. Or at least, I thought it was. For me, life was supposed to be a steady climb. You put in the work, and success follows. But things change in an instant, don't they? It all began when David took on the case against Davidson Enterprises. On the surface, it seemed like just another high-profile corporate case. A wealthy corporation accused of unethical practices, corruption, fraud, you name it. The kind of case that makes headlines but doesn't seem to change the world. But to David, this case was different. It wasn't just another notch on his career belt, it was personal. One evening, as we sat in the living room after dinner, I could feel the tension radiating from him. He was sitting on the couch, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on something I couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, a hint of anxiety in his words. "Emily, this case, it's bigger than I thought," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "The people involved, Davidson Enterprises, they don't just break the law. They control everything, and they'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets." I remember my initial reaction, nervous laughter. "David, you've handled tough cases before. What's so different about this one?" He didn't laugh. His eyes, usually so full of confidence, seemed distant, haunted. "It's not about the case itself anymore. It's about the people behind it. There are people in powerful places who are involved. You need to stay out of this one. Promise me, Emily, stay out of it." I thought it was just another one of David's attempts to protect me, to shield me from the dangers of his high-risk world. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Maybe it was the way he said it, or the nervous energy that seemed to have overtaken him. Either way, I couldn't ignore the warning bells going off in my head. The next few days were a blur. David grew even more distant, his mind consumed by the case. I threw myself into my work, trying to keep my thoughts occupied, but there was always this nagging feeling, a quiet unease that wouldn't go away. And then, a few days later, I found something that made my blood run cold. It started with an anonymous email. I'd been working late one night, sifting through legal documents, when my inbox pinged. The subject line was vague, important documents attached. Trust no one. I opened the email cautiously. Inside, there was a folder labeled Davidson Enterprises, Confidential. My heart raced as I clicked open the folder, revealing a series of documents I had no business looking at. They weren't public records or anything I'd seen in the case files David had shared with me. And then, I found something even more disturbing, a document that appeared to be a copy of a memo from someone inside the company, detailing internal strategies for dealing with a potential whistleblower. I didn't know what to make of it. My first instinct was to forward it to David, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way the email was phrased. Maybe it was my gut telling me this wasn't just about corporate corruption. So, I did nothing. I locked the email away, unsure what to do with it but terrified of what it meant. It wasn't long after that when things started to unravel. The phone calls came first, late at night, calls that seemed to come from blocked numbers, always asking about the case, always hinting at something more. But it wasn't until that morning, when I walked into the office to find a stack of papers on my desk, that I realized things were spiraling out of control. The documents were all from the Davidson case, only, they weren't what I thought they'd be. They were incriminating, not just against Davidson Enterprises, but against me. I should have known. I should have trusted my instincts the moment that email arrived in my inbox, but nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that followed. The morning after I found those incriminating documents, things moved faster than I could process. I spent the entire day pacing around the house, trying to make sense of everything, but my thoughts were jumbled, my heart raced, and my mind kept circling back to one undeniable truth: I had been set up. The phone rang at 8 a.m., a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated before answering. When I did, a cold voice on the other end sent a chill down my spine. "Ms. Wilkins, we need to talk." I didn't even have the chance to respond before the voice continued. "We have a copy of your communications with Davidson Enterprises. We have the proof you've been leaking confidential information. You'll be hearing from us soon." The line went dead before I could ask who was on the other end or why they were doing this. It was clear now, I was under investigation. And worse, someone had planted evidence to implicate me in a crime I didn't commit. The next day, the investigators showed up at my office. I had barely finished my morning coffee when two men in suits entered my office without knocking. One was tall, wearing dark sunglasses despite the office being dimly lit. The other had a more professional air about him. He was calm, collected, but his eyes betrayed a sense of urgency. "Ms. Wilkins," he began, "I'm Detective Lawson. We're investigating your involvement in the leak of confidential data from Davidson Enterprises. You're to come with us for questioning." It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. There had to be a mistake. I hadn't done anything wrong, but the pieces of evidence against me were mounting with every passing moment. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, trying to steady my voice, but the words came out shaky. Lawson didn't flinch. "We have emails. We have phone records. We have your fingerprints on documents tied to Davidson Enterprises." It was true. I had handled the documents, but only because they had been planted in my office. There was no way to explain that to him, though, no way to prove my innocence in that moment. As they escorted me out of my office, I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me. Some looked away, others watched with open curiosity, and a few whispered behind their hands. My reputation, built over years of hard work and countless victories, was crumbling in an instant. By the time I reached the police station, my phone was buzzing incessantly. The notifications were all from David. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The next few hours were a blur. I was questioned, interrogated, and treated like a criminal. My license to practice law was suspended, and by the end of the day, I was officially indicted on charges of corporate espionage. I had no idea what was worse, the charges or the fact that my own husband had let this happen. David had been a constant presence in my life, a source of support and strength, but now, he was nowhere to be found. The prosecution was moving fast, and they were using my name to make a point. This was a high-profile case. The media was already all over it. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My mind was racing with questions that had no answers. How had this happened? Who was behind it? And why hadn't David called me? Why hadn't he tried to help? By morning, my name was everywhere. News outlets were running stories about the indictment. Prominent attorney arrested in leak scandal. Lawyer faces charges for corporate espionage. The pictures they showed, my picture, were all taken from a previous gala, where I had smiled for the camera. completely unaware of the storm brewing just around the corner. The humiliation was unbearable. I couldn't walk down the street without people staring at me, pointing, whispering. It felt like I was drowning in a sea of judgment and betrayal. The phone calls from former colleagues came, too, most of them sympathetic, but others not so much. I couldn't help but feel the sting of their doubts. Then came the letter. The state bar had sent me an official notice. My license to practice law was revoked. Just like that, the life I had worked so hard to build, the respect I'd earned, was gone in a single day. I felt like I was falling apart, piece by piece, but underneath the devastation, I could still feel something else, something cold and hard, a fire, a need for justice. I wouldn't let this define me. I wouldn't let David's betrayal be my end. That night, alone in my apartment, I made a decision. I would find the truth. I would clear my name. And when I did, I'd make sure that whoever was behind this would pay. The first few days after my indictment were a blur of shame and panic. My life had been ripped apart in a matter of hours, but there was one thing I knew for certain: I wasn't going down without a fight. I spent hours locked in my apartment, sifting through old case files, legal precedents, and public records, anything that might provide a lead. The walls of my apartment felt suffocating. I was surrounded by the ghosts of my former life, a successful attorney in the world of law, and now, just a woman accused of a crime she didn't commit. David still hadn't contacted me. I hadn't heard a word from him since that morning when the police had arrived at my office. I couldn't decide if I was more furious with him for abandoning me or devastated by his apparent lack of concern for everything we had built together. Either way, the reality was that I couldn't rely on him anymore. I was on my own. But that didn't mean I was powerless. I had the skills. I had the training. I knew how to investigate. The only thing I needed now was the right approach, and the right people. I reached out to an old friend, someone who had always been in my corner during my rise in the legal world. Ethan Jennings, a former prosecutor turned private investigator. He'd left the DA's office years ago after a scandal of his own, but his expertise was still invaluable. I arranged to meet him in a secluded cafe, far away from prying eyes. I knew that this investigation would be delicate, and if word got out that I was looking for answers, the media would be on me like vultures. Ethan greeted me with a tight-lipped smile and a handshake that barely masked his concern. He'd always been serious, but now there was an edge to his demeanor that unsettled me. He knew the stakes. If we were caught investigating this case, we would both be in serious trouble. After I explained what had happened, Ethan didn't say a word for a long moment. He took his time, slowly chewing on the information, as if weighing the gravity of the situation. "This is huge," he said, finally breaking the silence. "If they're framing you, they're playing a dangerous game. Whoever's behind this has access to resources that go far beyond what I'm used to dealing with." I nodded, my throat tight. "I don't know how deep this goes, but I'll find out. I need to know who's pulling the strings, and if it's David, I need to know what he's hiding." Ethan didn't respond immediately, but his eyes darkened. "I'll help you," he said, "but this won't be easy. You're up against people with power. They're going to be watching us." He handed me a folder. Inside were documents, emails, and records that he'd already begun to pull together. The first thing I noticed were encrypted files I'd never seen before, but that seemed strangely familiar. "What are these?" I asked, my hand shaking as I flipped through the pages. The documents were all related to Davidson Enterprises. Every email, every document, every communication I had supposedly leaked. But there was something wrong. The dates didn't match. There were messages I'd never sent. Ethan looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and caution. "They're trying to make it look like you were the one leaking information. These are forged." Forged. The words settled over me like a weight, but it also lit a fire in me. Someone was framing me, and they were good at it. The next few days became a blur of sleepless nights, endless searching, and uncovering hidden patterns in the data. Ethan worked tirelessly with me, helping me decrypt files, uncovering email trails that led us to new leads. As I dug deeper into the case, one thing became clear: David had been involved in this scheme from the start. The pieces of evidence that had been planted in my office were too carefully arranged, too precise. Whoever had orchestrated this knew exactly what they were doing. But why David? Why would he turn on me like this? The thought twisted my stomach into knots. We had been a team for so long, partners in both life and work. The idea that he could betray me was unbearable. And yet, everything pointed to him. I went through my private records, piecing together moments from our past, conversations, decisions we'd made, cases we'd worked on. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, some small detail that would tie everything together. And then I found it. A series of strange financial transfers, large sums of money from an anonymous account to Davidson Enterprises. The timing was too suspicious to be coincidental. These transfers had occurred right around the time the data leak started. I didn't want to believe it, but it was there in black and white. The truth was staring me in the face. David wasn't just guilty of ignoring my situation, he was directly involved in the corruption I had been accused of. I was seething with anger, but there was something else too, a quiet, determined resolve. I would expose him. I would make sure everyone knew who he truly was. But I had to be careful. I had to play my cards right. There was no going back now. The investigation was no longer just about clearing my name. It was about taking down those who had betrayed me, starting with David. The air in the courtroom felt heavy with anticipation. My heart beat hard against my chest as I sat in the gallery, surrounded by reporters and onlookers, all waiting for the dramatic turn that was about to unfold. This wasn't just any case, it was my case. The same courtroom where I had once stood tall, defending clients, now became the stage for my fight for justice. But it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had been wronged, every person whose life had been affected by the corruption I was about to expose. David, my husband, the man I had loved, trusted, and built a life with. He was sitting in the prosecutor's seat, looking every bit the part, stoic, composed, and utterly unaware of what was coming. But I knew. I had the evidence. The truth was about to tear his world apart. I had spent weeks gathering every shred of proof: emails, financial transactions, phone records, each piece carefully placed, each discovery more damning than the last. I had walked the fine line between a scorned wife and a woman on a mission for justice. But now, it was time to pull the trigger. As the judge called the court into session, I couldn't help but feel a pang of fear. Would they believe me? Would they dismiss my evidence as nothing more than a desperate attempt to clear my name? The stakes were high. The media was already following every move, every whisper, every gesture, and if I made one wrong move, the truth might never come to light. But then, as the prosecutor, my husband, rose to speak, a quiet confidence washed over me. He wouldn't know what hit him. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," David began, his voice smooth and unwavering, "the defendant has violated the trust of our system, breached the confidentiality of a high-profile case, and endangered countless lives. We have irrefutable proof of her guilt." I almost laughed, but I managed to hold it together. Irrefutable proof? If only he knew what I had. I stood, my legs slightly unsteady as I approached the defense table. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me, the weight of their judgment hanging like a storm cloud. But I was ready. My moment had arrived. I motioned for my attorney to approach, and as he handed me a file, I stood tall, looking directly at David. For the first time in weeks, I saw something flicker in his eyes: doubt, confusion, fear. It was a moment of vulnerability, and I knew exactly what it meant. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I said, my voice calm, steady, but charged with emotion, "I stand before you today, accused of crimes I did not commit, and while I could argue for my innocence, I believe the evidence will speak for itself. But I ask you to listen carefully, not just to the accusations against me, but to the truth that has been hidden in the shadows. I placed the first piece of evidence on the table, a document detailing the financial transfers I had uncovered, linked to Davidson Enterprises. The court gasped, but it was only the beginning. I didn't leak those documents, I continued, but I know who did, and I know why. The man who has been orchestrating this whole charade, my husband, has been using his position to line his pockets, to manipulate the system, and to betray everyone who trusted him. I was his pawn, and I didn't even know it. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. David's face had drained of color. His fingers gripped the podium as if he could hold on to the facade he had built for so long. But it was too late. The truth had been exposed. I turned to the judge and the jury, my voice unwavering now. I've spent my career defending the law, upholding justice, but my husband? He spent his career exploiting it. He used me, used this system, and now he will face the consequences of his actions. I could feel the shift in the room. The jurors were whispering among themselves, eyes wide in disbelief, but there was no denying the evidence, the documents, the financial records, the emails. It all pointed to one person, David. As I sat back down, I watched him. He looked like a man who had been caught in the act, and now, there was nowhere for him to run. But the best part was yet to come. The prosecutor called a recess, but I didn't need it. I had already won. In the next few days, the media exploded with stories of the corruption within the prosecutor's office. Whistleblowers came forward, more evidence surfaced, the tide turned in my favor, and David's carefully constructed world began to crumble. But what hurt most of all was that the man I had loved, the man who had promised me everything, was the one who had set this all in motion. And as the press conferences rolled out, as the arrests were made, I couldn't help but wonder, how could he betray me so completely? The final twist came when the police arrived at David's office. They had found everything, his phone records, his financial transactions, his communications with the corporation involved in the leaks. He was arrested on charges of corruption, bribery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The betrayal stung. But there was a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing that the truth had prevailed. He had tried to destroy me, but in the end, I had exposed him for what he really was, a liar, a cheat, a criminal. And as I watched him being led away in handcuffs, I didn't scream, I didn't shout, I didn't even cry. I simply watched, cold and unblinking. Because I had won, and in the end, that was all that mattered.